Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Nothing more than a weekend getaway to clear my head and get some fresh air. A group of us, 5 in total, had planned this for weeks. We'd picked a spot deep in the Pine Barrens, far enough from any city that the stars would blanket the sky, uninterrupted by light pollution. It was perfect. Or at least that's what we thought. The first night felt like every camping trip I'd ever been on. The crackling of the fire, the smell of pine and earth, and the distant hooting of owls as we told stories and laughed around the campfire. The woods around us seemed peaceful, with the occasional rustling of leaves or snapping of twigs in the distance. It was nothing out of the ordinary, just the forest doing its thing. But the feeling of isolation, that creeping awareness of just how far we were from civilization, began to settle in as the fire died down. The wind picked up and the forest grew colder, quieter, like it was holding its breath. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up in the middle of the night, suddenly wide awake. At first, it was just the typical sounds of the forest, branches swaying, an owl's distant call. But then I heard something else, faint, barely audible at first, a low, guttural growl. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to hear it again. And there it was, closer this time, like whatever it was had moved. I told myself it was just a coyote or some other animal, but when I looked out of my tent's small window, I saw something. It was a shadow, tall and hunched, moving between the trees. It wasn't a bear or a deer, that much I knew. This was something else, something I couldn't quite explain. I must have watched it for minutes, though it felt like hours, before it disappeared into the dark. I wasn't sure if it had seen me, but I didn't dare move until the first light of dawn broke through the canopy. I didn't tell anyone about it the next morning. I didn't want to freak them out, and honestly, I wasn't even sure what I had seen. That was when the ranger showed up. He came strolling into our camp just after breakfast, unannounced and a little too calm for my liking. His uniform was disheveled, his hat crooked, and there was something off about the way he looked at us, like he was sizing us up. He asked if we had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. I hadn't mentioned what I saw, but one of my friends, Jenny, said she'd heard footsteps circling the camp while we slept. The ranger nodded slowly, his face unreadable before giving us a strange warning. These woods, they have a way of playing tricks on people. Best keep your wits about you. He left as quickly as he came, leaving us all a little unsettled. We tried to brush it off, blaming it on the isolation, but there was an unspoken tension now. That afternoon, we found tracks near our camp. They were large, too large to belong to any animal in these parts. Deep impressions in the soil, with claw marks gouging the earth. None of us knew what could have made them. The sun was sinking fast, and we all felt it, the weight of something watching us. The jokes from the first night were gone, replaced with nervous glances and half-hearted reassurances. But we couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, it got worse. It started with the noises, branches breaking, leaves crunching, something heavy moving just beyond the reach of our firelight. Then came the howling, long and mournful, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It echoed through the trees, and I saw the fear in everyone's eyes. Suddenly, a loud crash from the darkness. We grabbed flashlights, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. Just the wind, swaying the branches. Jenny swore she saw something move, a figure darting between the trees, but when we pointed the beams of light, there was nothing there. That's when we saw him, the ranger, standing at the edge of our camp, staring at us with wide, unblinking eyes. His face looked wrong, paler than before, his eyes too reflective in the light, almost animalistic. He stepped closer, his movements jerky and unnatural, like he wasn't used to being in his own skin. And then we saw it. His shadow stretched long behind him, but something wasn't right. His shadow had horns and elongated limbs. I froze. It wasn't the ranger anymore. It couldn't be. Before we could react, he spoke, his voice low and guttural. "You shouldn't have come here." The fire flickered, and for just a moment, I swore I saw his skin shift, ripple, like it was barely containing something underneath. Something inhuman. One of my friends screamed, and everything erupted into chaos. We ran, splitting off into the woods, the sound of crashing branches and heavy footsteps following us. I could hear the others shouting, panicking, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I realized I was alone. The forest was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Then, from behind a tree, I saw movement, a figure stepping out from the shadows. It was Jenny, or at least it looked like her. But something was wrong. Her eyes were wrong. Too bright, too predatory. She smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. It stretched too wide, her teeth too sharp. "You shouldn't have run," she said, her voice low, guttural, just like the ranger's. That's when I understood. Jenny wasn't Jenny anymore. It had taken her place, just like it had with the ranger. I stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The woods were closing in around me, the darkness growing thicker, more suffocating. And as the figure stepped closer, I realized with a sinking dread that I wasn't running from them. I was running to them, because deep down I knew. I had never left the woods. I was one of them. And now I was finally home. It was supposed to be a simple solo camping trip. I needed some time away from the city, away from people, away from all the noise. I picked a remote spot in the ironwood forest, a place I'd read about in an old travel magazine. They called it a hidden gem, the kind of place where you could really connect with nature. But what the magazine didn't mention was that the locals avoided it. They said the forest had a strange history, whispered rumors of odd disappearances and creatures that stalked the shadows. I didn't buy into it. I thought they were just stories to scare off city folks like me. I arrived late in the afternoon, and by the time I'd set up my tent, the sun was dipping below the tree line. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, the underbrush thick and tangled, like a net waiting to ensnare me. The silence was eerie. No birds, no crickets, just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I shrugged it off and told myself I was just spooking myself out. After a quick meal, I crawled into my tent and switched off my flashlight, ready to lose myself in the quiet. But the quiet didn't last. Around midnight, I woke to a strange sound, a low, mournful cry that seemed to echo through the trees. It wasn't an animal I recognized. It wasn't quite human either. It was almost like a wail, full of pain and something else. Hunger, maybe. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a wild animal, maybe a coyote. But then I heard it again, closer this time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I sat up, unzipping the tent just enough to peer outside. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the clearing, but the forest beyond was pitch black. I strained my ears, holding my breath. That's when I saw movement just beyond the tree line. A shadow slipped between the trees, long and thin, like a person, but wrong. It moved in a jerky, unnatural way, its limbs bending at impossible angles. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I should have gotten back in the tent, zipped it up tight, and waited until morning. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out of the tent, and aimed the beam toward the trees. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted branches and gnarled roots. But there was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath, laughing at myself for being so jumpy. I was about to turn back when I heard a voice. Soft, barely more than a whisper, but close. Too close. It was my voice. "Come here," it said, echoing back at me from the darkness. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just my voice. It was exactly how I'd sound, like someone had recorded me and played it back. The same tone, the same inflection. I took a step back, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing was me, an exact copy, down to the clothes I was wearing, the flashlight in my hand. But the eyes were wrong. Black, empty, like two dark holes punched into its face. It smiled at me, an impossibly wide grin that stretched too far, splitting its cheeks, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. I froze, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The doppelganger took a step forward, moving with that same unnatural jerkiness I'd seen before. Its mouth moved, but the voice that came out was distorted, like static on an old radio. "Why did you leave the tent?" it asked, tilting its head in a grotesque mockery of curiosity. "You should have stayed inside. You should have hidden." I turned and ran, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. I tore through the underbrush, branches scratching my arms, roots tangling around my feet. The sound of my own footsteps echoed back at me, but louder, heavier. It was following me, crashing through the forest like a wild animal, its breathing loud and ragged. I stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for breath, and for a moment, I thought I'd lost it. But then I heard something behind me, a low, throaty growl, like a predator savoring its prey. I turned, and there it was, standing on the edge of the clearing, watching me. The moonlight revealed more of its form, and I could see that it wasn't just me. It wore my face, but its body was elongated, stretched too tall, with long, clawed fingers that twitched and curled, eager to catch me. I knew I couldn't outrun it. My only hope was to hide. I found a fallen tree with a hollow underneath and scrambled into it, pressing myself into the dirt and leaves, praying that it hadn't seen where I went. I held my breath, heart pounding in my chest, waiting, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside my hiding place. I could hear it breathing, feel its presence. It was so close I could smell it, an awful, rotting stench that made me gag. I dared to peek out, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. It knelt down, its face inches from the hollow, and sniffed the air, grinning that awful grin. But then, it did something I never expected. It turned and walked away, vanishing into the trees. I waited, too terrified to move, until the first light of dawn crept through the branches. I crawled out of my hiding place, my body stiff and sore, and made my way back to the campsite, only to find my tent shredded, my gear scattered. There were no tracks, no signs of anyone else. But when I turned to leave, I saw something on the ground, a piece of torn fabric from my jacket. I picked it up, and a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't mine. I checked my jacket, but it was whole. Somehow it had taken something from me, something that shouldn't have been possible. I left the forest that morning, vowing never to return. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can still hear it, the sound of my own voice calling to me from the darkness, whispering my name. I've spent my fair share of nights deep in the woods, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that fateful trip. As a park ranger, my job was to ensure the safety of campers and the preservation of the wild. I relished the solitude of the forest, its whispers and rustles becoming a comforting backdrop to my duties. But that summer, something changed. It started with the usual signs of life, the chatter of birds, the rustling of leaves. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, an unsettling silence fell over the camp city. The night enveloped me like a thick, suffocating blanket. I lit the fire, its flickering flames casting long shadows that danced against the towering trees. Despite the warmth, a chill slithered down my spine. I brushed it off, attributing it to the isolation. Yet, as the hours crept on, I noticed the shadows were more pronounced, as if they were not mere tricks of the light. They moved in ways that defied logic, swirling, elongating, vanishing behind trees, only to reappear in my peripheral vision. I chalked it up to fatigue. After all, I had been working long hours, patrolling the park, ensuring everything was as it should be. Then came the sounds. Low growls and soft, sorrowful moans echoed through the trees, barely discernible beneath the crackling fire. They seemed to come from all directions, merging into a haunting symphony that tugged at the edges of my sanity. I stood up, heart racing, scanning the darkness for the source. Nothing. As I settled back into my chair, a faint rustle to my left drew my attention. I turned, expecting to see a deer or a raccoon, but instead the darkness shifted. A figure, tall and gaunt, stood between the trees, its outline obscured by shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to descend upon me. The following days were a blur of unsettling occurrences. Campers began reporting missing items, backpacks, food, even small belongings. Their voices trembled as they described feeling watched, an unseen presence lurking just beyond the firelight. I brushed it off, attributing their fears to overactive imaginations fueled by the night's creepiness. But deep down, I felt it too. One evening, I decided to investigate the woods alone, driven by an inexplicable urge to confront whatever was haunting my forest. Armed with only a flashlight and my resolve, I ventured deeper into the thicket, the trees closing in around me like a living wall. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I stumbled upon a small clearing where the ground was unnaturally bare, devoid of underbrush. A chilling wind whispered through the trees, carrying an earthy scent mixed with something metallic. At the center of the clearing lay an array of sticks arranged in a peculiar pattern, as if someone, or something, had deliberately created it. It looked like a crude symbol, foreign and unsettling. I knelt down, examining the ground, when suddenly the soft moans returned, closer this time. The shadows danced frantically around me, and I felt a surge of panic. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the rustling of leaves, louder now, like whispers conspiring against me. Then, from behind a tree, I saw it again, the gaunt figure, its features shrouded in darkness, watching me. Fear rooted me in place, but the instinct to flee surged within me. I turned to run, but the air grew thick, almost viscous, making each step feel heavy and labored. The forest erupted with sound as I sprinted, branches snapping, the rustling of unseen things. I glanced back, and in that fleeting moment, I caught a glimpse of the figure, its face illuminated by a flash of moonlight. Hollow eyes, a twisted grin, and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. My breath hitched in my throat as I stumbled over a root and fell, the world spinning around me. When I regained my senses, I was back at the campsite, my fire still crackling, but the forest felt different. The air was electric, tinged with an ancient energy that set my nerves on edge. I tried to convince myself it was all a nightmare, a trick of exhaustion, but then I noticed the symbol etched in the dirt beside my tent, exactly where I had found it in the clearing. Over the next few days, I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me, shadows lurking just beyond the reach of my light. The campers left in droves, their laughter replaced by nervous glances and whispered fears. I was alone, stranded in a web of paranoia. Then, on the last night, it all came crashing down. I heard a commotion outside my tent, a guttural growl followed by the unmistakable sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, heart hammering in my chest. The moon hung high, illuminating the clearing where I had first seen the figure. There, in the middle, stood the gaunt creature, its back turned to me. It emitted low growls, the sound resonating deep within my chest. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my grip. With a slow, deliberate motion, it turned, revealing its hollow eyes. In that moment, I realized the truth. It wasn't a stranger. It was me. I was the figure, trapped in a cycle, the forest feeding off my fear and isolation. The shadowy presence was not an external threat, but a reflection of my own despair and dread. I stumbled back, the weight of the realization crushing me. The forest had claimed me, my spirit forever entwined with its dark secrets. As I turned to flee, the shadows converged, engulfing me, and I knew then that I was lost, not in the woods, but in my mind. I write this now, a warning to those who enter these woods. Do not look into the shadows, for they might just reflect what you fear most, yourself. I've never been a fan of camping, but when my friend Mike insisted on a weekend trip to Deep Hollow Woods, I let him talk me into it. He said the forest was beautiful, untouched by civilization, a place where you could see the stars as bright as day. So I packed my bag and tried to psych myself up, though a strange pit settled in my stomach the moment we crossed into the dense, dark forest. Deep Hollow felt wrong, as if the trees themselves were watching us, ancient and wise. We hiked for hours until we found a spot that Mike insisted was perfect. It was a small clearing ringed by towering pines, thick moss blanketing the ground, and an eerie silence that pressed in like a physical weight. I asked Mike if he heard anything strange, but he just laughed, saying I was being paranoid. But I knew something was off. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, just dead silence, broken only by our footsteps. We set up camp, and as the sun began to sink below the horizon, that uneasy feeling grew. I told myself it was just nerves. We were miles away from any town, deep in the wilderness. It was supposed to be quiet out here, right? But as darkness took hold, the silence became suffocating, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then, just as we settled by the fire, we heard it, a strange, distant howling, unlike any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, guttural, and it seemed to echo through the trees, bouncing off the trunks and twisting around us. I glanced at Mike, but he looked just as uneasy as I felt. "That's weird," he mumbled. "Maybe it's just coyotes." But we both knew it wasn't. I'd heard coyotes before, and this was different. It had a strange, almost human quality, like someone in agony, mixed with an animal's snarl. We tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves it was just our minds playing tricks, but then the smell hit us. It was a pungent, sickening stench, like rotting meat and wet fur. Mike gagged, covering his nose, and I fought the urge to do the same. Then, in the faint light of our campfire, I saw something move. It was just a flash of something pale like skin, but it was gone before I could make out any details. I turned to Mike, who was staring into the trees, his face pale. "You saw that, right?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness. The howling began again, closer this time, and I could hear something crashing through the underbrush, moving fast, too fast. We grabbed our flashlights and shone them into the trees, but there was nothing, just shadows and twisted branches that seemed to reach out, clawing at the air. We stood there frozen, waiting for something to happen, but all we heard was silence. We exchanged a look, both of us silently agreeing that it was time to leave. We started packing up, moving quickly, but that's when the footsteps started. They were heavy, deliberate, circling us, and I could feel the weight of something watching, just beyond the firelight. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, and for a brief moment I saw it. It was tall, easily 7 feet, hunched over with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes were pitch black, like 2 holes carved into its face. It didn't look human, but it didn't look entirely animal either. It had a snout like a dog, but elongated, twisted, with teeth that gleamed in the light. "No!" Mike screamed, and the creature's head snapped toward him, its mouth opening in a silent snarl. It moved then, quick as lightning, disappearing into the shadows. We ran, abandoning our gear, crashing through the trees, desperate to get away. The footsteps followed, heavy and relentless, and every time I glanced back, I saw flashes of that pale skin, those black eyes, tracking us through the trees. After what felt like an eternity, we burst into another clearing, where a small cabin stood, its windows dark, the door slightly ajar. Without thinking, we ran inside, slamming the door behind us. The cabin was old, dusty, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. But at least it was shelter. We huddled in the corner, breathing heavily, listening to the creature's footsteps as they circled the cabin. Then we heard a voice. It was low, barely a whisper, but it echoed through the cabin, sending chills down my spine. "You shouldn't have come here." We spun around, and there in the shadows was an old man in a park ranger's uniform. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. "They don't like visitors," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to leave." Before we could respond, he pointed to a trapdoor in the floor. "Go, now." We didn't question him. We opened the trapdoor and climbed down, finding ourselves in a narrow underground tunnel. We followed it, crawling on our hands and knees, the smell of damp earth filling our lungs. We could hear the footsteps above us pounding against the floor and the low, guttural growl of the creature. Finally, we emerged into the forest, miles from where we had started. We ran until our lungs burned, until the first light of dawn touched the trees, and we stumbled out onto a dirt road. Weeks later, I went back to Deep Hollow Woods, desperate for answers. But when I asked the locals about the park ranger or the cabin, they just looked at me with a strange expression. "There hasn't been a park ranger in those woods for years," one man said, shaking his head. "The last one disappeared a long time ago. They say he got lost in the woods and never came back." I wanted to argue, to insist that I'd seen him, that he'd saved us, but the look in the man's eyes told me not to. So I left. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me, that I left something behind in those woods. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that low guttural howl drifting through the trees, calling me back to Deep Hollow. I always considered myself an experienced camper. I'd been hiking and camping in remote places for years, usually solo. There was something about being out there, surrounded by nothing but nature, that made me feel alive. The silence, the fresh air, it gave me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. But there was this one spot I'd heard whispers about, a place deep in the Montana wilderness. People talked about it in hushed tones, calling it the Hollow. It was said to be untouched, an area so remote that it wasn't even on most maps. But the stories were always vague, filled with odd warnings. Don't camp near the trees, or stay away from the fog if it rolls in. It was the kind of folklore that most outdoorsmen laugh off. But of course, it piqued my curiosity. I decided that was my next destination. After some digging and old map cross-referencing, I found the general location. It wasn't easy to get to. 2 days of hiking through dense forest, no trails, no markers, nothing. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. By the second day, even the birds had stopped singing. Still, it didn't bother me. I'd been in plenty of quiet forests before. The silence just meant I was far from civilization, exactly what I wanted. Late that afternoon, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with just enough space for my tent. There was a stream nearby which would be good for water, and the sun filtered through the trees in soft, golden beams. It was perfect, picturesque even. As the sun began to set, I built a fire, ate my dinner, and settled into my usual routine. By the time the stars were out, I was leaning back against a log, staring up at the sky. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a mist forming, creeping out from the trees. It started off slow, just a thin veil hanging low to the ground. But it thickened quickly, swirling at the edge of the clearing like it was alive. I stood up watching it. I'd seen fog before, of course, but this was different. It didn't move naturally. It stopped right at the line of trees, refusing to come any closer to my camp, almost as if it was waiting. "Just weather," I muttered to myself, though a knot of unease had begun to form in my stomach. I went to bed earlier than usual that night, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me. The mist still hovered at the edges of the clearing, thick and unmoving. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had long since died, and my tent was pitch black. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. There was no sound, no breeze rustling the trees, no animal calls, just absolute silence. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. It was coming from outside the tent, but it wasn't close. Maybe at the edge of the clearing. I listened for a few seconds, heart racing, trying to make sense of it. There was no wind, nothing that should have been moving. The tapping grew louder, closer. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, my flashlight in hand, scanning the area. The mist was still there, thick and swirling just beyond the tree line. But now, shapes moved within it. Dark, shifting forms, tall and thin. I couldn't make out any details, just long, shadowy figures pacing in and out of view. And then I saw it, something standing at the very edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the fog. It was tall, taller than any man, with impossibly long arms that seemed to drag along the ground. Its head was wrong, elongated, almost like it was wearing a mask, a pale oval where a face should have been. It was tapping its fingers on a tree, the sound carrying through the silent forest like a drumbeat. I froze. The figure stood perfectly still, but I knew it was aware of me. Its head was tilted slightly like it was listening. Then, without warning, it stopped tapping and stepped forward, just one long, slow stride. I panicked. I zipped the tent shut, clutching the flashlight like it was some kind of shield. My mind raced. I could hear the tapping again, louder now, closer. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to stay quiet, listening. I needed to think. What was that thing, and why hadn't it come closer? That's when I realized. The fog. It hadn't crossed the line of the clearing. Whatever that thing was, it stayed within the mist. I didn't know why, but for the moment, it seemed like the only thing keeping me safe. The tapping continued, circling the camp, always staying just beyond the edge of the clearing. I lay there, wide awake, my mind racing as the hours crawled by. Then, just before dawn, the tapping stopped. I listened for what felt like an eternity, but the forest remained silent. No footsteps, no whispers, nothing but the soft rustle of leaves as the wind finally picked up. When the sun rose, the fog had vanished, leaving the forest looking as serene as ever. But something about it felt wrong, like the woods were hiding a secret just beneath the surface. I packed up camp quickly, eager to get out of there. As I was finishing, I noticed something at the edge of the clearing. Footprints. Long, deep imprints in the ground, far too large and spaced too widely to be human. They trailed along the boundary of the clearing, stopping just short of where I had slept. I didn't wait around to inspect them. I slung my pack over my shoulder and hiked out of there as fast as I could, refusing to look back. It took me the entire day to get back to the car, and by the time I reached it, the sun was beginning to set again. As I drove away, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But that night, when I finally crawled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The next morning, I found dirt and leaves tracked into my house, large uneven footprints leading from my front door to the bedroom window. I haven't been camping since. As the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the horizon, I set up camp at Pine Hollow, a remote area in the vast expanse of wilderness I had patrolled for years. As a park ranger, I often spent nights in the woods, relishing the tranquility that enveloped me. But this night felt different, charged with an eerie tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The forest loomed around me, its towering pines casting elongated shadows that danced in the fading light. I lit my fire, the crackling flames offering a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. I pulled out my gear, double-checking my radio and supplies, but my thoughts kept drifting to the old legends that surrounded Pine Hollow. Stories of a watcher, an ancient spirit said to guard the woods, whose presence brought unease and fear to those who ventured too far into its domain. As the stars began to dot the night sky, the forest fell silent, An unnatural quiet blanketed the area, stifling the sounds of crickets and owls. I tried to shake off the feeling that I was being watched, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Yet, every so often I caught a glimpse of movement just outside the fire's glow, something shifting in the shadows, too quick for me to identify. Suddenly, a soft rustling drew my attention. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating a pair of glistening eyes peering at me from the darkness. My heart raced. A deer, perhaps. I held my breath, but the eyes didn't move, remaining fixed on me unblinking. Just as I began to relax, a low growl echoed through the woods, reverberating in my bones. I jumped to my feet, scanning the area. "Hello?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. The shadows seemed to deepen, and the air grew colder. I felt an instinctual urge to retreat to the safety of my truck, but I resisted, determined to face whatever was out there. Just then I noticed something on the ground, a trail of small, twisted branches leading away from my camp. Curiosity piqued, I followed it into the darkness, my flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. As I walked, the hair on my arms prickled, and the low growl from earlier echoed again, closer this time.
Yeah.
The trail led me to a clearing, and my breath caught in my throat. In the center stood a massive, gnarled tree, its trunk twisted and dark, with ancient carvings etched into its bark. Surrounding the tree were the remnants of old campfires, long extinguished and overgrown with moss. This place felt wrong, steeped in a thick, oppressive atmosphere that made my skin crawl. I stepped closer to the tree, compelled by a force I couldn't explain. The carvings depicted figures, twisted, distorted faces with hollow eyes staring back at me. As I traced my fingers over the rough bark, a sudden chill swept through the air and the growl returned, this time more pronounced, like a warning. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "I need to go," I whispered to myself. But as I turned to leave, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, its features obscured by a tattered cloak. My breath caught as the figure took a step forward, revealing a face that seemed both human and not, a face marred by shadows, with eyes that glowed like embers. "Why have you come here?" the figure rasped, its voice echoing in the stillness. I wanted to run, to escape the overwhelming sense of dread that engulfed me. "I'm just camping. I didn't mean to intrude." The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "This is sacred ground. You should not disturb the watcher." A deep instinct told me to flee, but my legs felt heavy. "What do you mean by the watcher?" "The guardian of the woods," it said, gesturing toward the ancient tree. "It watches over the lost, the weary, those who tread where they do not belong." The air thickened, and I suddenly felt a crushing weight on my chest, as if the very forest was bearing down on me. "I didn't mean any harm," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "I just wanted to enjoy the night." The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes boring into my soul. "The watcher does not forgive easily. Those who disrespect this place must pay the price." With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, the shadows clawing at my back. I sprinted through the forest, branches scratching at my skin as I dodged trees, the growl echoing behind me like a hunting predator. I could feel the presence closing in, the darkness swallowing the light of my flashlight. Just when I thought I had escaped, I stumbled and fell to the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of me. As I gasped for breath, I felt a cold shadow hover over me. I looked up, and the figure loomed above, the ember-like eyes glowing brighter. "Your fate is sealed," it whispered, its voice a haunting echo that reverberated through my mind. With a desperate cry, I scrambled to my feet and bolted toward my camp, my heart racing. The fire flickered, a fragile shield against the darkness. I reached my truck and fumbled for my keys, glancing back at the woods. The figure had vanished, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the trees. I jumped into my truck, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. My hands shook as I turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life. I sped away from Pine Hollow, the road ahead a blur as I escaped the woods and the watcher that haunted them. As I drove, the whispers followed, echoing in my mind. "You cannot escape," they taunted. "You are bound to us now." Days turned into weeks, and I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a figment of my imagination. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the watcher's hollow gaze, felt the weight of its presence looming just beyond the edge of my vision. And now, every time I return to the forest, a part of me wonders if I will see the twisted figure again, standing among the trees, waiting for my inevitable return to Pine Hollow, where the watcher continues its eternal vigil. That was the first thing the park ranger said to us. His voice was low, gravelly, like he'd smoked a pack too many in his life, but something about his tone made my skin prickle. We'd just arrived at the campsite, me, my girlfriend Sarah, and our friend Tom. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just us, the wilderness, and some peace away from the chaos of the city. But from the moment we pulled up, something felt off. The ranger stood there leaning against his truck, watching us with eyes that seemed too tired for the middle of the day. He didn't smile, didn't welcome us, just warned us. I laughed it off at first, trying to ease the tension. "Watching us? You mean like bears or something?" He didn't laugh. Instead, his eyes flickered to the tree line, where the pines stood tall and dark, their branches swaying lightly in the breeze. "Not bears," he muttered. "Things older than that, things that wear faces that ain't their own." Sarah shifted uncomfortably next to me, and Tom let out a nervous chuckle. But the ranger just stared at us, his gaze hard and cold. "Stick close to the fire at night," he said. "Don't wander too far, and if you hear someone calling your name from the woods, don't answer." With that, he turned and climbed into his truck, leaving us standing there in the middle of the clearing, a heavy silence settling in his wake. The sun was still up, but it already felt like dusk. The first night wasn't too bad. We set up our tents, made a fire, and tried to shake off the ranger's creepy words. Tom was the first to break the tension, cracking jokes and passing around beers. We laughed, toasted to a good weekend, and the forest around us seemed to lighten up just a bit. But later that night, when the fire had died down and the stars flickered coldly overhead, I heard it. A sound. It was faint at first, almost like the wind whispering through the trees. But then, louder. Crunch. Crunch. Like footsteps, but too slow, too deliberate to be an animal. Sarah stirred beside me, waking up just as I held my breath, listening. I glanced at Tom's tent across the fire, wondering if he'd heard it too. Crunch. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound, peering into the darkness beyond the fire's dying embers. The trees loomed, shadows thicker than they should be, their branches swaying with a rhythm that didn't match the breeze. And then I saw it, a figure, just beyond the first line of trees. It looked like a person, but there was something wrong. Their movements were jerky, too stiff, like they didn't quite know how to move right. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Tom?" I whispered, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, swaying slightly, staring. "Tom," I said louder, panic creeping into my voice. But when I looked back at his tent, the flap was zipped tight. There was no way he'd left without me hearing. Sarah grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. "What is that?" I don't know," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stay here." I grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on, shining it toward the figure. For a second, it vanished into the shadows, but then it stepped closer, just enough for the light to catch its face. My blood ran cold. It looked like Tom, but the eyes were wrong, empty, hollow, and the skin too tight, too stretched, like it wasn't meant to be on that face. My stomach lurched as I realized what I was seeing wasn't him. It was wearing him. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The thing cocked its head, mimicking a movement, and in a voice that sounded almost like Tom's but distorted, it said, "Don't be scared." Sarah screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the tent. We zipped it shut, our breaths ragged and panicked as the thing outside circled the campsite, its footsteps slow, deliberate. Too human to be a bear, but not human enough to be anything else. For hours we sat there listening as it moved around, sometimes too close, sometimes drifting farther away. But it never left. The sun didn't rise fast enough. By the next morning, the thing was gone. The forest was quiet, too quiet, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Tom didn't remember anything. Said he'd slept like a rock. Didn't hear a thing. But Sarah and I knew what we saw. I wanted to leave, pack up, and get the hell out of there, but Tom laughed it off. Said we were just freaked out by the ranger's ghost stories. He insisted we stay one more night. I didn't want to admit how scared I was. Didn't want to seem paranoid. So we stayed. That night we heard it again, the footsteps. But this time they weren't outside the campsite. They were right outside the tent. The zipper rattled, slow, like something or someone was testing it. Sarah squeezed my hand so hard I thought it would break, and I held the flashlight tight, my heart thundering in my chest. Then, a voice, low, familiar. It was me. From the other side of the tent I heard my own voice whisper, "Let me in." The morning came with silence. No footsteps, no voices, no ranger. Just a feeling. Something darker had moved through those woods that night. Tom still didn't believe us, but when we packed up to leave, I could see the fear in his eyes. He heard it too, even if he wouldn't admit it. As we drove away, I looked back at the trees. The shadows seemed to shift, move, and just before the tree line disappeared, I saw a figure, standing there, watching. It looked just like me, and then it smiled. You ever feel the woods watching you? Now I know what the ranger meant. I had always loved camping, especially the feeling of disconnecting from the world and immersing myself in nature. This trip was supposed to be no different. It was just me and my buddy Mark, heading out to a remote spot we found on an old hiking forum. The kind of place where GPS signals die and cell reception is non-existent. Perfect for a weekend getaway, right? The drive took us deep into the mountains, far away from any towns or people. As we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The trees felt ancient, looming over us like silent sentinels. There was an eerie stillness in the air, but we shrugged it off. It was just nature after all. We hiked for about an hour before we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp. It was a wide, flat patch of earth surrounded by thick woods on all sides, and beyond the trees, we could hear the faint sound of a stream trickling nearby. It seemed perfect. We pitched our tent, started a fire, and settled in for a quiet night under the stars. But as night fell, that stillness I noticed earlier turned into something else. A kind of suffocating silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the chirp of crickets. Mark joked about it being too quiet, but I could tell he felt it too. Around midnight, we started hearing the noises. At first, it was just a light rustling in the bushes. Probably a raccoon or something, we thought. But then there was a strange clicking sound, like two stones being tapped together. It was slow, rhythmic, coming from the edge of the tree line. We both fell silent, listening. The sound continued for a few minutes, then stopped suddenly. Mark tried to laugh it off, saying it was just some weird animal, but I could hear the unease in his voice. We both stared into the darkness beyond the firelight, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. The clicking came back. This time it was closer. I stood up, shining my flashlight towards the trees, but the beam only seemed to deepen the darkness. The shadows felt thicker, like they were moving just out of view. And then, just as quickly as it started, the clicking stopped again. The silence returned, even more oppressive than before. We sat by the fire for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Eventually, Mark suggested we call it a night and head into the tent. Maybe if we ignored it, whatever it was would go away. But sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the tent, every gust of wind, it all sounded too close, too deliberate. I could hear Mark tossing and turning beside me, just as restless. Sometime in the dead of night, I woke up to a noise that sent a chill down my spine. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching the leaves just outside the tent. They were slow, like someone was walking around, taking their time, inspecting us. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, long, deep breaths. Something or someone was standing just inches from us. Then came the scraping. It was a soft, slow drag, like nails or claws raking against the fabric of the tent. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen. Mark was awake too. I could hear him muttering under his breath, "What the hell is that?" We stayed still, paralyzed by fear, as the scraping continued. Then suddenly it stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading back into the woods. The silence returned, but this time it felt even worse. Like something was watching, waiting. Neither of us slept after that. We sat in the tent, wide-eyed, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. Without saying a word, we packed up camp as quickly as we could, eager to leave whatever had stalked us during the night. As we hiked back to the car, the forest felt different, more alive, but in a wrong kind of way. The birds were back, the wind rustled through the trees, but that feeling of being watched never left. We didn't talk much on the drive home. What could we even say? But before we left the mountains, we made one stop at a small diner on the edge of the nearest town. We were desperate to shake off the dread, to feel normal again. As we sat there sipping coffee, we overheard a conversation between two locals at the counter. "Did you hear they found another body up in the woods near Dead Man's Creek?" one of them said. My blood ran cold. "Yeah, second one this month. Sheriff thinks it's a bear, but I don't know," the other replied. "Folks around here say it's something else. Something older." I exchanged a look with Mark, and we didn't need to say anything. We both knew. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't just an animal. It was something watching us, hunting us, and we were lucky to have made it out alive. Now every time I hear the click of stones, I remember that night in the woods, and I wonder how close we came to being the next ones they found. I'll be the first to admit I'm not the outdoorsy type, but when my best friend, Hannah, insisted we take a weekend camping trip to unplug, I went along with it. It was her idea of a birthday gift. A couple of nights in nature, no phones, no distractions. Just the two of us and a place she'd been going to with her family for years, Lake Cedarwood. Hannah swore it was a hidden gem deep in the woods and miles from any town. "It's always been so peaceful," she said on the drive there. "You'll love it." By the time we reached the lake, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the water in a soft, golden glow. It was beautiful. I couldn't deny that. The lake was perfectly still, like a sheet of glass, reflecting the dense forest surrounding it. The silence was almost eerie, though. No birds, no wind, not even the usual buzzing of insects. Just stillness. We found a clearing by the lake's edge and set up camp, the only sounds being our movements and the occasional splash of a fish in the water. After a simple dinner by the campfire, we sat quietly, watching the stars blink into view above us. The lake was a dark mirror, perfectly reflecting the night sky. As the fire crackled and the night grew colder, Hannah nudged me. "Want to go for a quick night swim? It'll be fun." I hesitated. The lake looked so unnaturally still, but I didn't want to be a buzzkill, so I agreed. We stripped down to our swimsuits and waded into the water, which was surprisingly warm, like bathwater despite the cool night air. The surface barely rippled as we swam out a little way from shore, the quiet of the lake wrapping around us like a thick blanket. We floated on our backs for a while, staring up at the stars, laughing softly about old memories. It was nice, peaceful, until I noticed something off. I glanced over at Hannah, and that's when I saw it. In the water beside her, there was another figure, a reflection, just like ours. But it wasn't hers, and it wasn't mine. It was someone else. I shot up, treading water as my heart raced. The reflection floated just beside Hannah, rippling faintly, but staying there, like it belonged in the water. I couldn't make out a face, just the dark outline of a person standing on the surface of the water, staring down at us. "Hannah," I whispered, my voice trembling. She looked over at me, confused. "What?" I pointed to the water, trying to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Her eyes followed my hand, and for a moment she didn't react. Then, slowly, her face paled. The reflection was still there, hovering beside her in the water. It didn't move. It just stared. Without another word, we both swam frantically back to shore, scrambling out of the water, gasping for breath. When we turned back to the lake, there was nothing. The reflection, the figure, it was gone. The water was still again, as if nothing had happened. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Hannah didn't answer. She just stared at the lake, her eyes wide with fear. We didn't talk much after that. We just dried off and retreated to the tent, locking ourselves inside. I lay awake for hours, listening to the silence, waiting for some sound, some explanation. But the night stayed quiet. The next morning we woke up early, both eager to leave. As we packed up the campsite, I couldn't stop glancing at the lake. The water was calm, glistening under the morning sun, completely normal. It almost felt like we had imagined the whole thing. As we were about to leave, I walked to the edge of the water one last time. The lake was so still, so clear, that I could see my reflection perfectly. And that's when I noticed something again. There, standing beside my reflection, was another figure. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was the same figure from the night before, dark, indistinct, standing beside me in the water. But this time, as I stared, it slowly raised its hand and waved. I backed away, stumbling over the rocks as Hannah came over. "What's wrong?" she asked, seeing the panic on my face. I didn't say anything. I just pointed at the lake, but when she looked, the figure was gone. The water was empty, still reflecting nothing but the trees and sky. There was no sign of the dark figure. It was as if it had never been there, but I knew what I'd seen. We both had. We left Lake Cedarwood in silence, neither of us willing to talk about it. I haven't been camping since, and I never plan to go back. But sometimes when I pass a pond or catch a glimpse of myself in a puddle after a rainstorm, I swear I see it. That figure standing just beside my reflection, just watching and waiting. I've always loved the outdoors, being away from the noise, the stress, the chaos of everyday life. Camping has been my way of reconnecting with nature and, frankly, with myself. So when the chance came for a solo trip deep into the mountains, I couldn't resist. It was supposed to be peaceful, a way to clear my mind. But it ended up being the most terrifying experience of my life. The first 2 days were uneventful. The campsite was secluded, surrounded by towering pines and thick brush. The air was crisp, with the scent of damp earth, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. The spot was perfect, far from any trails or signs of other campers. Exactly what I needed. By the third night, though, I noticed something strange. I had set up my tent in a small clearing, a good distance from a quiet river. The trees were dense, making it feel like I was cut off from the world. That evening, I sat by the fire, enjoying the silence. But then I heard it, branches snapping like footsteps just beyond the tree line. I stood up, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a deer or some other animal, I thought. Still, it felt off. Animals usually avoided humans, especially ones that made as much noise as I did. But whatever was out there wasn't shy. The footsteps came closer, crunching over leaves, deliberate and slow. "Hello?" I called out, hoping it was just another hiker, maybe someone who had wandered too far. But there was no reply. Just the sound of those heavy, slow footsteps. I shined my flashlight into the woods, but the beam only revealed more trees stretching endlessly into the dark. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The footsteps stopped as if whoever or whatever it was knew I was looking. I stayed frozen for what felt like minutes, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just an animal after all, maybe a large one like a moose or a bear. So I went back to the fire, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods, once peaceful, now felt claustrophobic. Every creak of the trees and rustle of the wind sent my senses into overdrive. I barely slept that night, waking up at every sound. At one point, I swore I heard soft breathing just outside my tent. I sat up, heart racing, but when I unzipped the flap and peered out, there was only silence and darkness. The next day I was exhausted but determined to enjoy the trip. I decided to explore further down the river, hoping to shake off the weird vibes. The air was still, the forest unnervingly quiet, but I pressed on. That's when I found it. About half a mile from my campsite, tucked between two massive pines, was an old, tattered tent. It looked abandoned, its fabric torn and dirty, as if it had been out there for months, maybe years. I crouched down to inspect it. Inside were scattered belongings, moldy clothes, a rusted lantern, a notebook half buried in the dirt. Curiosity got the better of me and I flipped through the notebook. Most of the pages were damaged beyond recognition, but a few entries were still readable. They described someone's camping trip, much like mine. The last entry, though, was chilling. "Something is watching me. I hear it every night, getting closer. I think it's trying to get inside my tent." The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Was this a coincidence? Maybe, but it felt too close to what I'd experienced the night before. I quickly backed away from the tent, feeling exposed. The woods didn't feel serene anymore. They felt predatory. I decided to head back to my campsite and pack up. This trip was over. Whatever had happened here, I didn't want to be next. As I hurried back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing, but the sensation of eyes on me persisted. The woods seemed darker now, more sinister. When I finally reached my campsite, I froze. My tent was slashed open, torn apart like some wild animal had gotten to it. My gear was scattered, my food torn from the cooler. But it wasn't the destruction that terrified me. It was the footprints, human footprints, barefoot, leading from the tree line, circling my tent, and then disappearing back into the woods. Panic set in. I grabbed what I could, stuffed it into my pack, and bolted down the trail. I didn't care if I left things behind. I just needed to get out of there. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees as I ran. I kept hearing things, a twig snapping, a low rustle. But every time I looked back, the trail was empty. After what felt like hours of running, I finally reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and sped off, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I thought I'd left it all behind. I thought I was safe. But when I got home that night, I found dirt on my living room floor and a single footprint by the window. I never camped alone again.